Well, this is take 2 on this video. I did try and record this video before, but I looked like I'd just run a marathon. Frankly, I still do look a state. I'll explain that later, but yeah. Now that I've calmed down a little bit, and I'm feeling a little bit more relaxed and a bit cooled off, I'm going to talk about what I believe are some of the best entry points into fantasy and science fiction. So this is my top 10 entryways into the two genres, which often cross over at times. And yeah, a lot of people have been doing these top 10 fantasy and sci-fi books for beginners lists. And I thought I'd show mine because mine is noticeably different from others. There are some similarities. There are a few books that appear on my list that appear on others as well. But I think mine has a little something to it that makes it just a touch different. So, I've kind of divided mine into levels. And the reason I've done that is because different people have different reading proficiency levels. You could be starting fairly low key. Maybe you're not looking for yourself, but you're looking for your child. Maybe it's your niece, your nephew, your son, your daughter, whatever. And you want something to encourage them to keep reading because they've read Harry Potter and now they need something else and they don't know where to turn. That's fine. We've got our level 1 picks. Now, there's the obvious ones. You could go with the Percy Jackson series. You could go with the Earthsea series. You could go with Redwall if you want to go for something a bit older. But the one book that I always like to champion is The Never-Ending Story by Michael Ende. Now, people who have heard of this generally have heard of the film. Now, the film only covers about the first half of the book. The second half, I feel, is the stronger half. It contains more responsibility, more of a moral lesson. It makes you think more. This is a book I would recommend to adults as well as children. It is a very fun, very imaginative, very whimsical fantasy tale, and it's one that has stuck with me for my entire life. I highly recommend this book to everyone, but if you want to give a fantasy experience to young kids, maybe, like I say, they've just finished reading Harry Potter and they want something that's familiar enough, that's fun and fantasy driven, but is different from Harry Potter, this one standalone book, this will stick with them and this will touch them in ways that other books won't. I'm not going to say that, Percy Jackson, for example, isn't a decent series to give to your kids. You could give them the Alcatraz series by Brandon Sanderson. They're great books in their own right. They're entertaining and they meet what they're intending, which is to provide an exciting journey that children can get to grips with. But I feel that unlike them, this book actually has a moral message to give that most books for this age demographic just don't manage. And I also think, unlike a lot of middle grade books, that the prose in this book is genuinely good. Perhaps because it's an older book, but the prose in this is... and the only thing I'd say that comes close is Earthsea. Earthsea is another fantasy series that I would recommend for kids around the same age, but even then, I think Never-Ending Story, it's just got this whimsical, lyrical nature to it that books for younger audiences lack nowadays. So, my first recommendation, Never-Ending Story. My second recommendation is going to be an obvious one. And I've got a couple of alternatives because people will likely have read this if they're interested in reading these kinds of books. But I think that especially for adults and especially for adult men, this is a book that a lot of people will have overlooked because they'll have pigeonholed it as the YA that teen girls read. And that's not fair because this is actually a damn good book and worth your time. That is The Hunger Games. This is your level 2. This is your YA introduction. Your level 2, You don't want to go straight into high-end sci-fi. You don't want your hard sci-fi elements. This has got enough sci-fi elements that it will feel like a sci-fi book for people who are coming in from contemporary YA or from contemporary fiction in general. You can go straight into this and you can understand what they're trying to get across. It's a dystopian, near-future sci-fi, and the science fiction elements are well done, but it's all about the political the political groups, the system that they're trying to develop, and it's nice that they managed to that the author has managed to build a world here with a political system in place that doesn't feel like it's some kind of ham-fisted allegory for the American political system, which so many of them do now. This feels like it's actually a sci-fi fantasy world that you might want to read about. And whilst a lot of people say that the first book is the best and it goes downhill, I actually feel the opposite way. I do feel that the first one is better than the second. The second, I do feel, goes over a lot of the same key points that the first book did. The third book, however, shakes things up a bit. It's more complex, it's got more intrigue, it's got more character moments, and yes, Katniss as a character is irritating, irresponsible, and spends half of her time in the fucking hospital. That is true. Mild spoiler that Katniss is in all 3 books. But yes, that is the case. But whilst she is less of a relatable character throughout that book, she's not supposed to be. She's supposed to be a confused teenage girl way in over her head. So I think it fits the story well. I would recommend this, but there's a good chance you've already read it. If you have, another series worth giving a try, though not necessarily as good, still worthwhile, is the Divergent series. Again, similar situation. A lot of people do not like how it ended. I feel the ending is actually quite well constructed and fits the theming and style of the series. Another one that's very similar, but has more of a sci-fi element, including a bit of space travel, is the Red Rising series, with the first book being very similar in tone and feel to something like The Hunger Games, but moving more into a space-based sci-fi in later books. All good series to start with, but The Hunger Games is my choice, my number 2 choice. It is my level 2, so we're starting with our middle grade choices. Level 2 is our YA introductions, and for my second level 2 introduction, this is more in the fantasy wheelhouse, it's a big chunky one. His Dark Materials. This is a huge bind-up of His Dark Materials. It's all 3 in 1. Now, this book is likely to intimidate any child you give it to, though it would be perfectly reasonable to give this to someone in their early teens. It's actually hurting my wrist to hold it like that. You could just buy the books individually. It's a trilogy, they're about this big in paperback. So, honestly, no bigger, no more intimidating than The Hunger Games if you buy the trilogy as a trilogy. But I saw this big bind-up, it's a big floppy paperback, and I kind of liked it. It entertained me, and you know what? As one story it works. I don't recommend just reading The Northern Lights, or as it's called in other areas, The Golden Compass, which is a censored version of Northern Lights. I don't recommend just reading the one. Read the whole trilogy. It's a good trilogy. It's got elements of fantasy that are similar to something like Harry Potter. It's got kind of a multiverse style to it. It's our world, but not quite. And there are elements to the fantasy that are worked on in ways that most middle grade don't. So that's built up and it's a little bit more mature. That's why I recommend this as the YA entry. Whilst it's technically written for adult audience, it was never meant to be YA or middle grade or anything like that. It is regularly presented as being written for a younger audience because the protagonist is a young girl. it still reads well if you're young. You could give this to an 11-year-old and they would get something out of it, but I feel it reads better as an adult. There are themes in it. There are questions about religion and about your perceptions that I feel are explored in a way that an adult reader is going to pick up on, but teenagers and children may not. And I think that's interesting. I think that's worth spending a bit of time on, just to read through it. You can read this story as a teen and then read it again as an adult and get something different from it. So yeah, I recommend it for that reason. That is my third choice, and that is level 2. It's level 2 sorted. Level 3, I have another 2 books here. Now, we've got plenty of fantasy there, but we haven't really done much in the way of sci-fi. So my next one is an entryway into science fiction for any adult reader. You can read this as a teen again. In fact, you could reasonably read most of these as a teenager and still be fine. Maybe the last 2 or 3. And I would go, you know what, probably not teenage material, but yeah, all of these you could read as a teenager and you'd be fine. Like, these are entry level after all. But we're finally getting into adult fiction. So these are all adult books from this point on. And the first one is a space opera in a way. It's not really, it takes place in space. It's not your traditional space opera. But it is a classic of the sci-fi genre, and that is Ender's Game. Now, this is not the cover that most people are familiar with. This is, I think, the newest cover, the Orbit UK edition. I've got the whole set with these covers, which are different than the ones that everyone else has, but that's not the point. Ender's Game. It has some similarities to the likes of Hunger Games, and even Harry Potter. It is very familiar in some of its structure, but it takes those themes and builds on them and does them in a far more adult and mature manner. Ender's Game is a classic for a reason, and if you find that you really enjoy the themes and the stylings of this book, you can dig in deep. You can keep going. This will read fine like a standalone, but if you want to, you can keep going. You could carry on with Speaker of the Dead. It is Speaker for the Dead, I think it is. Then there's Xenocide, and then there's I can't remember the name of the 4th book, but there's a whole series of books, and if you decide that they're not necessarily for you, you could always go the other way, and you could read Ender's Shadow, which is a companion novel to this, told from a different perspective, where you follow a different character, and it reads very differently with it, whilst also having similar themes and ideas, and then that has its own series of books leading on from there. You could then also, if you find that you enjoy this world, you can go back and you can read the prequel books for the Formic Wars, where there's an entire series of books talking about the history of this world leading up to Ender's Game. There are so many books in this series that you can find so much to enjoy. So if you find Ender's Game works for you, you can keep digging deeper. This can open up a lot of different experiences in just this one series, because Ender's Game is very, very different than the Formic Wars. They are very different in tone, but they're the same universe, they're the same writer, they're the same feel in some respects, without being completely the same. So Ender's Game, a great entryway without it being a requirement to read more and more. Now, if you've already read Ender's Game, and again, it's a classic, it's one loads of people recommend, so you may have, then the other big entryway into sci-fi that I pick would probably be Leviathan's Wake. Again, that's a more obvious choice. My choice is Ender's Game. I think Ender's Game is a better intro. It's shorter, it's the more classic sci-fi tale. Leviathan Wakes is a fantastic book. I highly recommend it, and it effectively leads you into The Expanse, which is now a 9-book space opera series with really good hard sci-fi and great characters. A fantastic choice if you want something other than Ender's Game at this level. But yeah, Ender's Game is the one I'm going to go with. Now, for fantasy, I think that your introduction to fantasy for adults has to be Sanderson. And I'm going to go with Warbreaker. And why Warbreaker? Well, first of all, it's a standalone. So you can just read this one book and get a sense of what Sanderson's like, get a feel for good modern fantasy, good modern adult fantasy, and then if you like what you read, you can read more. It is in the Cosmere, so if you read this, you can then go on to read the Mistborn trilogy. You can go on to read all of the Stormlight archives, which are 1,000-page epic books, of which there are currently 4 of them out, and another 6 planned, that could last you for the rest of the damn year. There is so much more that you can dig in deep if you like Sanderson's writing style and you want a continuous universe where there is tenuous links between them all. Warbreaker is a great introduction to Sanderson, and by reading this you can get a feel for him, then move on to other books. Or you can read this and go, okay, I've had a taste of Sanderson, I don't need any more, I can move on to other things, and you can read other works by other authors. Now, if you read Sanderson and you find that you enjoy what you're reading, there are other authors that you can move on to that I feel are a good step away from Sanderson. They've got a good feel behind them, and a lot of people who read Sanderson find that they enjoy these as well. A couple that I would recommend, especially if you've already read Warbreaker, is the Powder Mage trilogy by Brian McClellan. The first one being Promise of Blood. Fantastic flintlock fantasy, so it's a bit different. And it's written by someone who actually studied under Brandon Sanderson, so he has some of the trappings of Sanderson's writing whilst having his own style as well. I feel his books are more complex. His characters are a little less of the focus. He focuses more on the action, but his characters are still well represented. His characters are still well realised. Promise of Blood is a book I thoroughly enjoyed and I would really, really recommend, but you can go the other way. You can go more traditional fantasy, something like Robin Hobb with Realm of the Elderlings. Assassin's Apprentice would be the first one, I believe. Yeah, I believe it is. It's Assassin's Apprentice is the first one. Then it's Assassin's Quest and Royal Assassin. Anyway, a great choice if you want to go that way. There are plenty of adult fantasy that you can go for that are similar in tone, feel, and writing style to Sanderson without being exactly the same. But I do feel that if you need a starting point, if you've never read modern adult fantasy, Warbreaker is where I would start. I would start here. If you like this, read more Sanderson. If you enjoy this but you want something a bit different, go on to Promise of Blood. You can't go wrong there. So, that's level 3. What about the next step up? Level 4 is where I'd go for things that are more conceptual. Things that have elements to them that are not just the entertainment. They've got a message to say. They can be interpreted in different ways. This is where I would start considering books that are considered to be by a lot of people more literary fiction. That's pompous arsehole way of saying worthwhile. What they actually just mean is that these books make you think a bit more, but they like to downplay the idea of a book that's entertaining just for the sake of being entertaining. Entertainment on its own is not crap. Entertainment is fine. But if you do want something a little bit more contemplative, if you do want something that goes into more depth and has more of a message to say, you want to think deeply on something, you don't just want to be entertained, I do have some recommendations. Now, there are plenty of dystopian and political sci-fi books that I could mention. Some of the more obvious ones would be things like 1984 or Fahrenheit 451. We could go down some other routes as well. There are a few interesting ones, like the works of Robert Heinlein, so Starship Troopers, or The Moon is a Harsh Mistress, both good options. But the one I would go for if I had to pick one, just the one. You could read all of those, and they're all fairly short, to be fair. But if I was only going to give you one, it would be Brave New World. This is the one book that I feel takes the cautionary tale of the future and does it really, really well. The others have interesting concepts, but I feel they've missed the mark. Fahrenheit 451 is my personal favourite. Its prose is by far the best. Its structure is more interesting for me. I enjoyed reading it more, but the likelihood of that being the future is extremely slim. Same with 1984. Whilst 1984 has more definite themes, again I think it misses the mark with what it's predicting of the future. But these are older books now. These have been around for more than half a century, and their predictions may not have aligned completely. Brave New World, I feel, has aligned shockingly close to what society is and how it's moving forwards. And I feel as a cautionary tale, it depicts a scary future where we are docile and we give in to basic pleasure because it's easy. And it allows the human race to effectively become a slave race of mindless drones. That's a worrying thought, and this book covers it well. It covers it in a way that really makes you consider how media is portrayed, how entertainment is handed to you, whether or not you are being placated and just subjugated through being left content. It's a very, very interesting entry into the political dystopian end of sci-fi, which I don't necessarily consider them to be true sci-fi. I like to consider dystopians to be their own genre because they're so far removed from what we would consider to be science fiction in a lot of other ways. But it's definitely a huge part of the genre, and one that I would be remiss to not mention. Again, if you've read Brave New World, you want something different, George Orwell's 1984, Fahrenheit 451, or Starship Troopers are all good choices. But what if you wanted some science fiction that is a little bit more out there? You don't want something quite so serious. You want something that you can laugh and you can have fun with, and you can get a little bit of levity out of. Well, I've got you covered. Snow Crash. Snow Crash by Neil Stevenson is very hard to describe without giving it away, if I'm honest. It is a cyberpunk romp. It's fun, it's easy to get into, but it's allegorical. There is a lot of hidden depth in the way this is written, and it's fun to follow the main characters. It's interesting to see how they're depicted, and honestly, Ready Player One wishes it was this book. It really, really wishes it was this book. Snow Crash is... It's almost a parody of its own genre while still playing the genre straight at the same time. And that is a very, very narrow line to walk. It's a tightrope to walk. So I highly recommend this if you're interested in cyberpunk or something along those lines. Remember that it's a little bit of an older book now, and its predictions on how computers and what it calls a metaverse, which I think, given what Facebook is doing, is quite amusing. Even still, what it calls the metaverse, what might be cyberspace or the Matrix in other books of the same style. It displays it well. It portrays it well. And I think that this will give you a good grounding for other books. Now, you could read something like Neuromancer, which plays it way more straight, and yeah, that's a good choice. I would say William Gibson's books are always a good option, but maybe not just Neuromancer. Go a bit further and read further into his series. Mona Lisa Drive, I think, is a stronger book altogether. But Snow Crash, I think, as the one book representing the cyberpunk stylings of sci-fi, is the one that I would push over anything else. I think that it tells its story in a more fun and more interesting way. There are others, there's plenty out there, but they tend to be quite unknown and quite underground. A lot of them are like self-published books. There's a few of them that I might recommend, but they tend to lack the polish. Snow Crash has a lot more polish than a lot of those. Anyway, that is my next level. So that was level 4 would have been these two books. So we've got our first level with our middle grade, second level with our YA recommendations, third level with our introductions to adult literature, and our fourth level, which is things that have a little bit more nuance, a little bit more allegory to them. What is our fifth level? Right, this is the point where if you're an experienced reader, you read a lot, you want to be able to get into sci-fi, fantasy. What books am I going to recommend? Well, at fifth level, I have 3 books to recommend. And these are books that I feel are going to be instrumental in getting you from reading thrillers, horrors, contemporaries, romances, into reading sci-fi and fantasy if you're an experienced adult reader who reads a lot and just wants something a bit different. So, science fiction wise, I've gone for Pandora's Star. Now, Peter F. Hamilton tackles sci-fi in a way that that is a little different, but it still feels like a traditional hard sci-fi setting. It's less about spaceships and more about his portal systems of travelling from planet to planet, but it is still basically, in all respects, a hard sci-fi space opera-esque book. It is part of a duology, so the second book, Judas Unchained, I highly recommend. They are big, chunky boys. There is a lot of depth and a lot of hard science fiction elements in here to keep you going. It will make you ponder and consider whether or not this world could be the way it's being described. There are other things I could recommend in its place. Another great series that I could recommend would be the Culture series by Ian M. Banks. Fantastic series, but it is way longer. This is just 2 books. Admittedly, they are big chunky books, but it's just 2 books, and then you've got a feel for it. And I think it is a more down-to-earth and a more gritty science fiction in some respects. I suspect that if you really want something that's going to give you that feel of science fiction, and you've already decided that The Expanse is not what you want, this is the next step I'd go for. Honestly, if you've read The Expanse and you want something else, you want something a bit harder, a little bit more in depth, that's going to go into the nitty gritty of the sci-fi elements in its storyline, this is the book I'd pick next. This is the natural progression from The Expanse, I feel. So yeah, Pandora's Star by Peter F. Hamilton. I cannot recommend this enough. But what if you're not really here for the sci-fi? What if it's the fantasy you want? Well, I'm gonna shock absolutely no one with my recommendation, and that is if you're wanting to get into high fantasy, if you're wanting to get into epic fantasy, and you've already considered the likes of Sanderson, and now you want something else, well, A Game of Thrones. You already knew A Game of Thrones was going to be the recommendation. I can't think of anything better. Now, some people would say you should read things like like The Lord of the Rings. I don't think so. I think its prose has aged, and it's got to the point now where new people reading that book, unless they are used to reading classics, are going to find it stodgy and uncomfortable. Unless you've already read it, it's not a book I recommend to other people. I did not really enjoy Lord of the Rings. I found that I didn't get along well with its writing style. And I think that things have changed in fantasy enough now that the Lord of the Rings just doesn't work for a lot of people unless they're used to that kind of writing. Now, sure, if you're reading classics all the time, if you're the kind of person who's read Jane Eyre and Middlemarch, and you're wanting to get into fantasy, then yeah, sure, go straight to Lord of the Rings. That's exactly the projection I'd expect for someone who reads in those areas. But if you're reading modern contemporary or modern thrillers, this is the perfect way in. And I know it's an obvious choice, but I'm going to justify it. This is a murder mystery. It's not really a fantasy. It's got fantasy in it. But this book, A Game of Thrones, this one specifically, is a murder mystery that just happens to take place in a fantasy world. The sequels are fantasy books. This is a murder mystery book. And it's a really, really well-written murder mystery that goes into the politics and the systems of governance in this medieval world. So yes, you need to be okay with reading something that is basically historical fiction with a little hint of magic. But if that's okay, you'll find that the majority of this is focusing on solving that mystery and learning about these characters and working out what their motivations were, what their schemes are, playing the Game of Thrones, trying to position yourself for power. That's what this book is. If you really love it, and you should, because it's awesome, then go on and read the sequels. Stop after book 3. Books 1, 2 and 3 make a beautiful trilogy, and frankly you don't need to read beyond that. If you read beyond that, you're going to put yourself in the same situation that everyone else is, and that is that you've read now books 4 and 5 and he hasn't finished writing them. But books 1, 2 and 3, they all cap off nicely. There is a good ending. It's an open-ended ending, obviously, but there's a good ending at the end of book 3 that becomes a very satisfying, very, very good trilogy. So yes, A Game of Thrones. It's obvious, but it is the one you should go for. Now, if you've already read A Game of Thrones, which you may have, it's one of the biggest fantasy out there. Honestly, at this point, you know what you like. And there's loads and loads of epic fantasy out there. I could sit around recommending loads of them, but honestly, at that point, you're probably well read enough that you don't really need this video, and frankly, I probably can't direct you. There are some things that I would say that once you've read this, you're probably ready to move on to. You could try Malazan Book of the Fallen, or Malazan Book of the Fallen, depending on how you want to pronounce it. Everyone on BookTube seems to say Malazan, but apparently it's supposed to be pronounced Malazan. I don't care either way, but you could give that a try. It's extremely detailed and very, very deep, and a rich experience for those who like that. I would recommend them. It's a very long series, very, very detailed series. I do think that A Game of Thrones is better. You could always go down the route of the really extreme allegorical fantasy, like, for example, Gene Wolfe with Shadow of the Torture, which is the first book in Book of the New Sun. That is an option. Again, I would steer clear of that as your entryway into fantasy. I know some people call it sci-fi. It's really not. It's fantasy with a sci-fi drip added. But yeah, that is an option. But again, at that point, you don't need this video. That's not an entryway into sci-fi or fantasy. That's the end. That's the end game. That's where you end up. So yeah, Game of Thrones, I think, is where you want to go if you want something detailed, you want something complex. The number of characters, point of view, the richness of this world, this is a step above what you will get from most other epic fantasies. Yes, you could argue something like Stormlight Archive has the same level of grandeur, but it has nowhere near the same number of characters or the same depth of world. There are plenty of characters, there is a lot of intrigue and a lot of elements to it, but it is nowhere near as complicated. And Sanderson's prose is way, way more approachable. George R. R. Martin's prose, I feel, is better. It's more lyrical, it's more interesting. But at the same point, Sanderson's prose is more approachable, it's much easier to read. So it depends on what you're looking for in your prose. But yeah, this is where I would say you want to be at that upper level. But if you want something a little out of left field, I've got one more recommendation. And that is Pedido Street Station. Now this is, again, it's another big chunky boy. It's always going to be big chunky boys at the top level. This is the book that I would recommend to everyone who wants something that's in the middle. This has elements of science fiction, elements of fantasy. It's urban, it's weird, it's almost steampunk in a way. I don't want to say too much about what this is. What I will say is this is the kind of book that will get you thinking, get you feeling, get you contemplating the ideas behind it. This is very, very allegorical, but it's also got fantasy and science fiction elements in it that will be entertaining, that will be disturbing at times, that will be intriguing. The intrigue in this book is second to none. This is probably one of my favourite series, and it's one that a lot of people don't talk about. It's called the Baslag series, and there are other books in it. There are 2 more books in this series. They get progressively shorter, which is rare for science fiction or fantasy. But yeah, I recommend this book for anyone who wants something more. And I don't want to say anything beyond just my recommendation because I don't want to give anything away. It's better if you go into this largely blind. Now, if you do want to try out this author before reading this, you could try The City and the City, which is a standalone. It's only about half as thick, and it is, again, very, very interesting. It reads almost like an episode of Black Mirror, if that will sell it to anyone. I think this is the better book, but again, The City and the City is a good entryway into China Melville's writing style and what to expect from him. But those are my 10, and like I say, it's a tiered system. You've got your level 1 with middle grade, that would be Neverending Story. Then you've got level 2 with Hunger Games and His Dark Materials. Your level 3 with Warbreaker and Ender's Game. Level 4 is where I would put Snow Crash and Brave New World, and then your level 5 is where I would be sticking Pandora's Star, Game of Thrones, and Pedido Street Station. Those are the 10 books I would recommend, and the good thing about them is a lot of them are first in the series, but some of them are standalones, or they read well as standalones, but they branch out. All of them branch out. So if you find that you hit a point which is the perfect point for you, you don't have to keep climbing up. Level 5 in this tiered list is not better than level 4 or better than level 3. It's more complex. But maybe you don't want that complexity. Maybe what you want is a fun, entertaining read. Maybe level 3 is perfect for you. You know what? Level 3 is perfect for me as well. Senlin Ascends is perfect level 3, yeah, maybe level 4, right, depending on how you interpret it. Its prose is fairly easy to read, it's not overly complex, there's not that many characters to follow, but you know what, this is a fantastic book and it's one of my favourites. You don't have to go more complex, but I wanted to put them in complexity order because I feel that makes for a more engaging top 10 list. Because I'm not ordering these in, you know, this is better than this. I'm ordering these in, if you started from the bottom and worked your way up, you would have had a fantastic flavour for science fiction and fantasy. If you start with Neverending Story, then move on to reading the Hunger Games trilogy and His Dark Materials trilogy, then you moved on and you read Ender's Game, and maybe you read more of the Ender Saga, or maybe you just read Ender's Game, doesn't matter. Then you read Warbreaker, and from there you go, you know what, I'm going to try something more complex. You read Brave New World, perhaps you read 1984, and you read Fahrenheit 451. Maybe you do read them, they're fairly short, but perhaps you don't. Right. You also read Snow Crash, and you find a little bit more entertainment in that, and you move further on again. Once you've read one level, you might jump up another level, but maybe you won't. Maybe you'll read those and you'll go, you know what, I enjoyed the allegory, I enjoyed those elements, but I want to go back to just fun sci-fi fantasy romps. So maybe you jump back down, you read Mistborn, right, and you read The Expanse, and that's where you're comfortable. And that's great, because you know what, they are fantastic books. So hopefully someone will get something out of this list, and you'll find a book that you hadn't considered. If you do, let me know, because I'd be overjoyed to find that someone's got something useful out of this, and maybe we can get a little bit more of a conversation going as to which books you feel introduce people well into this genre. And until next time, I'll see you later. Bye. Quick addendum. I never did explain why I look so shagged out, did I? Because I did say at the beginning of the video I'd explain that. This book, I searched the entire house looking for this book. I do not know how, but I had basically mislaid this book somehow. I knew where it was. I knew it was by the desk in the living room. I searched the entire living room, couldn't find it. I looked through the desk, wasn't there. Looked all throughout the living room, could not find it anywhere. Went up into the bedroom, wasn't there. I went into the box room. I unpacked every box and bag of stuff I've got in storage one by one, and then packed them away. It took me over an hour. It was not there. I came back downstairs, looked in the cupboard next to the desk. There it was, right at the very back. I had searched the entire damn house. Like, I was making myself ill looking for this damn book. But I wanted the book so I could show it to the camera. That's the only reason I wanted the book. I wasn't planning on reading it now. I just wanted to show it to the camera. Like, I've got other stuff on. I'm not starting another book. But yeah, that got me really, really het up, and yeah, that was an example of ADHD at its worst, because I hyper-focused. I needed to know where that book had gone. I knew it was in the house. I knew I'd bought a copy of Snow Crash since I'd moved in, and I knew it was in this room, because I swear I'd sat right next to that desk and read it. I knew I'd read it there, but I was going through and I was like, did I maybe read the digital one? Did I read it on my Kindle? Is that why I can't find the book? Did I actually buy it digital? Like, a part of me was just going crazy, thinking, I know it's here, but I couldn't find it anywhere. Yeah, and I got to the point where the sweat was pouring off me, because I've got chronic pain, chronic fatigue, I've got limited mobility, and I'm going round. I was moving furniture. I moved the sofa to try and look under it. I moved the desk. I was crawling under the table. Like, I have not moved this much in weeks. So yeah, I was really, really sore and tired. The sweat was pouring off me. Yeah, I started recording the video 10 minutes in. I had to stop and go, I look awful, and I sound like I'm dying. Take a 5-minute break, have a drink, start again. So yeah, that's what I did. Yeah, I just thought I'd let you know, because I thought you might be interested. You never know. Maybe you care. Maybe you give a shit. Or maybe this is rambling and you probably have switched the video off at this point. But that's fine either way. Hopefully the top 10, so it wasn't really a top 10, it's just 10. But hopefully the 10 books was an interesting list and you got something out of it all the same. And maybe me showing off Snow Crash to the camera was worth all of the anguish and pain after all. Probably not, but I can hope, right? See you next time anyway. Bye. For real this time. Bye.